3, 2, 1, start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend to this 10 to 15 minute showcase. Today, I'm going to discuss my topic in EPQ, which is to what extent is solar energy the most viable energy source available to maximize the reduction of greenhouse gases? Now, here's a summary of what I'm going to be talking through in my presentation, and let's just get into it. So first of all, why did I choose this topic? So there are multiple reasons for why I have chosen this topic. Growing up, I have been very interested in the sixth mass extinction event that was taught to me. You know, this event where humanity and the ecosystems will be devastated by global warming. And I assume your teachers have taught you the same thing when you were younger. I was told that this would cause many consequences like environmental degradation, natural disasters, war, terrorism, and cataclysmic events. I was also told that there was a solution to this, a solution to fight to save humanity, which involved using renewable energy like solar, wind, hydroelectric, and sometimes nuclear. So, if the solutions to such a gargantuan problem that could be the actual end of humanity were so straightforward, why weren't they implemented? Why were we still using fossil fuels? So, yeah, why aren't these um why aren't these renewable energy sources and alternative energy sources implemented at scale? So, with climate activists like Greta Thunberg, who are criticizing the government and saying that they they are the ones who are preventing renewable energy being used, is it only the governments to blame? Unfortunately, that is only part of the reason why. The technologies of these renewable energy sources and alternative energy sources to fossil fuels, they themselves contain advantages and disadvantages that make them very difficult to implement. And I have been very interested in discovering specifically why. What are the very specific advantages and disadvantages to each energy source? And which energy source is really the most viable? Which energy source is the best on average to combat global warming and the addition of greenhouse gases? With me having a particular interest in solar, I want to talk about what extent is solar the most viable energy source to maximize reduction of greenhouse gases. How good is solar being an energy source to help us reduce greenhouse gases as much as possible in a very viable way, efficient, effective way? So, yeah, what did I focus on? In this project, I focused on the comparison of energy sources, and I would take the sources and I will compare the advantages and disadvantages. And I also had the focus to see which technology is the best to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prevent the climate crisis, with the focus um, on reducing greenhouse gases. That is the main focus of the question. Now, what is the project about? So, as a brief outline, so first of all, I would research about the technology of each energy source and how I feel like this is important because in order to understand how the advantages and disadvantages play out, you need to understand how the technology works. So I will also research about the advantages and disadvantages with each energy source. I also researched about the economics. I emphasize the criteria of economics because it is incredibly important. An energy source which is cheaper around would be certainly more viable to implement. So the thing with economics is that there's this very specific way of measuring the total cost of the energy source from its manufacturing, from from money it takes to manufacture, to maintain, and then to dispose. That is called the life cycle cost, and I've explored it because I've made it its own category. I think in the ending sections, I also compared each of the energy sources based on specific criteria. For example, I used whether they had a fuel cost, how expensive it was to maintain, whether it produced any waste, whether it affected the environment. I compared it so that we could truly compare to see which energy source is the most viable all around. And I would also make an opinionated conclusion strictly based on the evidence. I would look at the strictly on the evidence and say which is truly the best. Now, what was the summary of the research that I found? So for solar energy, I found that it is plentiful in it is plentiful in supply. It has raw materials free of charge. It requires low maintenance. It's silent. It's very flexible, being able to be installed in many locations. It can be installed on your rooftop, on car parks, on the walls. There's solar paint. However, it has this advantage of having only a specific amount of solar energy being used because solar energy is not that efficient. It has inconsistency and intermittent issues, storage issues, and in order to make solar PV cells, you need to use dangerous materials, and that can cause problems. Nuclear, and the next one, nuclear. It can be considered more viable. Because it has high energy density. That means that it can produce the same amount of energy as other renewables in terms of less space. Nuclear can produce um, the same amount of energy as solar, but solar will take 450 more times space, according to one source. However, some things that don't make nuclear viable is that it releases radiation. There are accidents that can happen, and the storage of nuclear waste is a problem because at the current moment there is no permanent storage solution of nuclear waste that takes into account earthquakes that can break the containers that nuclear waste is inside. Next one, wind. Wind, it doesn't release greenhouse gases in energy production. It has free fuel. It can be used in varying scales, and it doesn't require much maintenance. Wind turbines are also becoming larger and gaining a higher efficiency, which can make it more viable. However, wind turbines can be dangerous to wildlife. They can be noisy compared to solar, which is silent, and it has an expensive upfront cost and it faces inconsistency issues. So hydroelectric is a viable candidate because it doesn't release greenhouse gases as well. It has free fuel, can be used at varying scales. It could be more viable and advantageous because it is viable because it pairs well with renewable energy. And a very important thing is that it can meet electricity demand because it is a dispatchable resource. For example, dam water. Whenever you need electricity, the dam will let out the water, and with this, you can kind of control the electricity that you produce, and you can meet the fluctuations in demand. This is important because all of these renewable energies need to be integrated into the grid, and the grid uses a just-in-time system where the um, energy generation needs to equal energy demand. So solar can meet that. So that was around the summary of the research I found, and at the end, I kind of found out. I in the end, based on the evidence, I found out concluded that nuclear is the most viable as it's very high energy dense, and it is very consistent and it can provide baseload power compared to other renewables which are very intermittent and inconsistent. And when you're intermittent and inconsistent, you have a difficulty being integrated into the grid. You have difficulty being integrated into the grid. You need to burn natural gas. Like, for example, when the sun sets, you need to burn natural gas in order to meet the demand because there's no more solar energy, and you can't store solar energy because there's no scalable solar energy like the pumped hydropower and lithium-ion batteries, which do not have been used in scale. However, nuclear is only a short-term viable solution as the fuel of nuclear, which is uranium, will run out and become more expensive in increasing years. So the other renewables are going to be the very viable long-term solutions, and nuclear can help to buy us time in order to develop technologically. So what is the process of EPQ? So um, the I've the process of the EPQ. So I started out thinking that I wanted to do something in biomimicry, but I changed to green energy because biomimicry didn't have a lot of resources, and I changed to what extent is solar energy the most effective renewable energy resource, which I think that the wording made it seem that you need to be the most efficient, which is not the case, and um, which is the most, which is the best to implement in all criteria. So we changed it to what what is the most viable energy sources available to maximize reduction of greenhouse gases, because I also wanted to focus on nuclear without having to justify why it's renewable. Because at the end of the day, it is which is the best energy source to stop climate change. To what extent is, and in the end, I wanted to make it more argumentative, so I changed it to what extent is solar energy the most viable energy source for 2025, the reduction of greenhouse gases. Essay writing format. Therefore, have I was able to very easily sit down and write. I think it felt like something that I could do. I didn't have to force myself to do it so much. There was an abundance of resource in my topic, which was very good, so that I could like take the information from different sources and see what was good. I used a Gantt chart in order to manage my time, which I felt I did in a good way, so that I felt like I did it in a good way so that I could see what do I need to do now and what do I need to do this week and next week and stuff. I was also referencing constantly so that I never really got lost. I never really, other than a few times, I always knew which information came from which source. And the fifth one is triangulation of sources. Like whenever like I was unsure of the credibility of the information in one source, I would always check multiple sources to see whether they agreed, to like see whether the information is credible. Now, struggles I overcame. So the first struggle I overcame was I felt very as a Jan intake who is completing the EPQ, only have 4 months, and so the EPQ there's a huge amount of information on this topic. So um, there's only small tasks like filling out the production log, adding small edits to different parts of the project, which can make it add up to be a very gargantuan task, especially when you're juggling for A levels, ECA, and edX mathematics trials. But I use a Gantt chart. I use a daily and a weekly planning method. Um, I wrote down what I'm going to do every hour. I focus on short-term deadlines and then long-term deadlines. But short-term deadlines, I could understand what to do now. So I was difficult to find time to do the EPQ. As I said, I'm a Jan intake taking 4 levels and an EPQ and 3 ECAs. So to ensure everything went smoothly, I would do the EPQ every day from March. I did use maybe around the whole month of March. I would use 7:45 to 8:45 and 9:15 to 10 p.m. in order to schedule. I would use that time and I would schedule subtasks I will have to do for EPQ, like planning the project, doing the slides, doing the speech, and stuff like that. Where was I? I was also finding it difficult to write in the correct format. In order to write EPQ, you have to write in a very argumentative tone, argumentative, evaluative, analytical tone. I felt that my tone was too descriptive, so I really had to learn how to use argumentative words, compare the different energy sources on a similar playing field, which is why I used the criteria in the end of my evaluation of the energy sources. And I also I asked the teacher to help me how to be less descriptive and more analytical. I also found it very difficult to read so many sources. I use maybe around 50 to 60 sources, although some of them are repeated. So reading the sources, trying to read such a long piece of literature and try to select information is very hard. But I realized that you need to read the prefix, you need to read the abstract and see if you can select information there without going to the whole source. Skim first through everything to get a rough idea, and then search for specific information you want. You can use the Control F key in order to search for specific words, which is a really big time saver. Now, failures, some of the failures that I experienced. So some of the failures I experienced that I didn't complete as much of the EPQ as I want, because there was a Chinese New Year break in January, which I didn't really complete the EPQ. And if I did have at least planned a outline and written more on the project or done research, it would have saved me a lot of time later. Another thing that I didn't really do well was that I scheduled my meeting late. I got my supervisor a bit late, therefore he couldn't really help me in the early stage of the process, which is a shame. I also didn't include as many academic references as I wanted to. I used a lot of websites, and I did use triangulations of sources to make sure that those websites agreed on the same thing, but it would have been better if I could have just gotten more academic references on JSTOR and Google Scholar. I also didn't really write EPQ as I went along. I just copy pasted all of the information, the research into one document, and I should have wrote as I went along to save time later. So how will this go on to affect me in the future? I have confirmed my passion for engineering. I would love to research and develop the green technology. It has also developed my critical thinking skills and my research skills. Conclusion. So the lessons I've learned is use it with daily and weekly planning system, schedule EPQ with enough time, always ask for advice, use the holidays to do EPQ, write EPQ as you go along, reference as you go along, and use as many academic credible skills. Okay, thank you, have a nice day. Yeah. Any and thank you. Thank you all for listening. Do you guys have any questions?